Climate University. We're so grateful to have the Executive Director of Clean Prosperity, Michael Bernstein, as well as Cathy Orlando, Citizens Climate International's Program Director, joining us up north to give us the down low on what's going on with Canada. So if you have questions, feel free to start using the chat. For all of our YouTube viewers, feel free to start putting questions in YouTube. And we are so grateful to have all of you with us. We'll get started in just another minute here at the top of the hour. But for all those that have joined early, feel free to start putting in the chat any questions you have and what brought you here. And I know that we've got a couple of questions even earlier on that were pre-submitted, so I'll put those in there for Michael. And we also will be putting a link where you can follow along with the slides here in the chat. So there's that. And here is the full report from Clean Prosperity, if people are curious as well. So with that, it is the top of the hour and we have a full agenda. So for those that are coming in later, we'll fill you in. But for everyone that's on the line and live right now, welcome to Citizens Climate University, a weekly webinar program of Citizens Climate Lobbies that provides CCL supporters like you and I with access to in-depth training opportunities on topics relating to climate change and effective climate advocacy. I'm your host, Brett Cease, and tonight's topic is understanding updates to Canada's carbon fee and dividend policy. We're going to be joined by CCI's Program Director, Cathy Orlando, and Clean Prosperity's Executive Director, Michael Bernstein, for a training that's going to update attendees on helping understand the emerging updates to Canada's carbon fee and dividend policy. A quick little housekeeping review. For all of those on the line, we are recording this training right now. So at this point, if you are curious or if you have to drop off, we'll put a link where you can find it afterwards. You can just go right to our YouTube channel as well and find it. All lines are muted, and we're actually going to go right to the chat rather than pull EV tonight. So feel free to put your questions for Michael directly in the chat, or if you're joining us with YouTube, we'll monitor that stream and feed them on over here. And at this point, they have a really straightforward presentation for the first half hour, and then we'll dive into some ambitious Q&A. So with that, let me just welcome our wonderful guest tonight. Michael Bernstein is Clean Prosperity's Executive Director. As a trained economist and successful business executive, Michael joined Clean Prosperity in 2018. His career has spanned business, management, consulting, international development, and politics. And prior to Clean Prosperity, Michael was the CEO of Mama Earth Organics, a small business that delivered organic produce from local farms to families around the Greater Toronto area. I'll have a chance to let Cathy tell a little bit more about that relationship, especially that CCL Canada has nurtured throughout the years with Clean Prosperity. But let me quickly introduce Cathy as well. Cathy Orlando works as Citizens Climate International's Program Director, where within an exceptional team, she creates the framework to empower volunteers throughout the world to build political will for evidence-based climate action in over 60 different countries. Cathy's been managing adult volunteers online since 2004, is a published scientist, and started CCL's first international chapter back in September of 2010, has been going full steam ever since. And with that, I will spotlight you, Cathy. We are so grateful for all of you being on the line, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you for that wonderful introduction, and I won't take much time. I just wanted to take a moment to contextualize the relationship between Citizens Climate Lobby Canada and Clean Prosperity. Citizens Climate Lobby Canada is the grassroots mobilization for carbon pricing for the most part, and Clean Prosperity is the grass tops mobilization, and we occupy two very separate and unique niches within the climate movement in Canada, but so complementary. And I'm very grateful for the work that Clean Prosperity has done. And they've worked with us over the years. In 2014, they joined us. The members then joined us in Washington, D.C. when we went to lobby there. And between 2016 and 2018, their former executive director presented at every single Citizens Climate Lobby event we had. We leaned quite heavily on their research. They are just a remarkable carbon pricing research organization. Very grateful for their work. And, you know, this relationship continues with Michael now at the helm, and the work that they've been doing is fueling our volunteers here in Canada with great information, and we're very grateful to have them helping us in Canada and here tonight to help you as well. So thank you. Michael, the floor is yours.
Great. Thanks so much, Cathy, and thanks, Brett, and thanks to everybody for coming. It's really an honor to be able to be here with all of you. I've known about CCL's work for a number of years now, and have always been just really impressed and encouraged by the tremendous work you've done. I've had a chance to go down to DC and meet with some of the folks who've been in DC and be part of a from sort of I didn't go on to the Hill, but I was there during a lobby day and saw what was done. So really great to be with all of you. And what I'm going to do is spend the next 20 or so minutes talking about carbon pricing in Canada. I'll try to give you some detail without going all the way through, every detail, and then leave enough time for us all to talk, because really look forward to your questions and to the dialogue. So with that said, let me share my screen here, and hopefully everybody can see it. If for any reason you can't, I see a thumbs up, so that's always a good sign. So let's talk through this. Let's see if I can just, last trick here is advancing through the slides. There we go. So I'm going to cover a number of different topics. I'm just going to talk through the federal and provincial relationship and how carbon pricing works across the country. Tell you a little bit about how the tax and rebate design works in Canada. We'll talk a little bit about the large industrial emitters, talk about the new climate plan that was announced in December, so fairly recently, and then talk a little bit about what does that all mean? What are the emissions impacts of the plan, and how might that relate to maybe adding on a border carbon adjustment? So those are kind of the topics that I want to run through with you all. I think the headline here is, Canada has a very ambitious climate or carbon pricing plan, definitely one of perhaps arguably the most ambitious climate and carbon pricing plan, not climate plan, but carbon pricing plan and trajectory in the world, if it's fully implemented. So, and unlike some other carbon pricing schemes in the world, that policy has survived at least one election now federally, and I think is an important counter example to the narrative that had emerged over recent years that carbon pricing might be a good policy in theory, but it was politically very treacherous for politicians who chose to adopt it. You heard a lot of that. I'm sure many of you would be familiar with it coming out of the Yellow Vest protests in France. I don't believe that's correct or fair, but I think that was the narrative that came out of it. So I think Canada, I think of the Canadian policy not only as an effective policy that is going to have a lot of impact on emissions in Canada, but our hope really is that it can be an example for other countries, including our neighbors to the US, of course, of how you can design a policy with elements that make it politically acceptable and supportable. And as you'll see, and as many of you may know, it actually mirrors fairly closely some of the policies that you all have been advocating for across the United States. So I think, as you will probably be familiar with, the headline on the carbon tax is that it is going up to $170 per ton, 170 Canadian, of course, per ton over the next 10 years. It is currently, as I'll talk about in a minute, at $30 a ton. Yeah, I think I'll just actually skip over the summary and get right into the details of it. So to go to the next slide. The first thing I think to understand about the policy is that it is a backstop policy. So the federal government has said, look, we want each province to either come up with their own plan that involves a price escalation that looks like this. So started at $20 per ton in 2019, and then went up $10 a ton each year until 2022, so $20 to $50 over 4 years. And then after 2022, it's going to continue at $15 per ton per year through 2030. That gets you to the 170. But instead of the federal government imposing that on each province, what it said was, you have the choice to come up with a system of your own design. It could be a carbon tax, it could be a cap and trade system. And what you need to show us as the federal government is that your system is going to get the same amount of emissions reductions as our system would have gotten if we put it in place in your province. And the provinces have done different things with that. Some provinces already, in fact, had their own system. As many of you would know, BC, for example, has had a carbon price of its own since 2008. Quebec had a cap and trade system since, I believe it's 2013. And so those provinces kept their own systems, and other provinces made different choices. Some imposed a carbon tax. I don't believe any designed, well, I guess maybe Newfoundland did. So most designed a carbon tax, some adopted a cap and trade, and others just said, you know what, we disagree with this policy. We're going to refuse essentially to do anything about it. And for those provinces who did that, the federal system kicked in as a backstop in those provinces. And so of the 10 Canadian provinces right now, you have 4 provinces who are actually under the federal carbon tax system. It happens to be some of the most populated provinces like Ontario, where I am today and where Cathy is. And actually it's most of the middle of the country that is under the carbon tax regime. Yeah, so I think that's what so what you end up with, if I actually go to the next slide here, is you end up with a bit of a patchwork of policies that looks like this. So you see the dark blue is the federal system. And then you have various colors for other kinds of systems in the other provinces, all which have been deemed to be equivalent to the federal system in terms of emissions impact. The other thing to point out about the system is that, you know, there are really 2 systems operating at once. Even though we often talk about it as the federal carbon price, those 2 systems are, one is one that applies to industrial emitters. So these are facilities that are emitting more than 50,000 tons of carbon per year. And then there's a separate system that's often called the fuel levy or the retail tax. And that essentially applies to everybody else except these big industrial emitters. So the retail side is the easier one to understand. It looks more like the proposals that CCL has advocated for, and it's a straight price on combustion of fossil fuels, whether that be gasoline, natural gas for home heating, etc. And that money is then recycled back to Canadians. And I'll talk a little bit more about how that recycling works in a second. But on the industrial side, the system is pretty interesting. It is considered an output-based pricing system. And the way that works is it is not based on the total number of tons of emissions, of carbon emissions that a facility produces, but instead it's based on the emissions intensity of production. So if you're a steel mill, as an example, the way your charge would work is you are first compared against all other steel mills in the country based on how much carbon per ton of steel you're producing. That's the emissions intensity itself. So tons of carbon per unit of output, in this case, tons of steel. So you're compared against your peers. And then there's a stringency factor that's applied, which is typically 80%. So to keep it simple, imagine all the steel mills, we look at all of the tons of carbon they emitted, we divide it by the total amount of steel produced, and we get an average to say, look, there's 2 tons of carbon, just to use an illustrative figure. This isn't the precise number. There's 2 tons of carbon that are emitted for every ton of steel produced. And then the federal government says, okay, we're going to put the threshold at 80% of that number. So we're going to multiply that 2 tons of carbon by 80%, which comes out to, I think, 1.6, if I'm doing my math correctly, 1.6 tons of carbon. And anything below 1.6 tons per ton of steel, you're off the hook, right? You don't have to pay a price for any emissions below that 1.6. But if you emit 2.6 tons for every ton of steel, well, that extra ton, right, that 1 ton that exceeded that threshold of 1.6, you've got to pay the price on that 1 ton of carbon. So why do they do that? The basic logic for that is that it's a concern about carbon leakage, which I'm assuming is a term that folks on this call will have heard. But the essence of that for anyone who hasn't is, the government has decided, and I tend to think it's quite a logical decision, that if we're applying a carbon levy on our steel mills, and the end result of that is that steel mill moves outside of Canada and continues to produce steel, but just not in Canada because of the costs we've imposed, well, we've actually done nothing for the climate because that ton is still being produced. But what we have done is chase jobs and economic activity out of the country. The long-term and better solution for that, as we'll get into later, is border carbon adjustments. But until we have that in place, this is the interim solution that is deemed to still impose a charge on those industrial emitters, because there's still a carbon tax that's applied. And if they find efficiencies or reduce their carbon output, they are going to save the equivalent of $30 a ton. In today's case, or in 2030, they would have saved $170 a ton by reducing emissions. So they still have that incentive, but they're paying less overall. And thus the potential risk of them fleeing due to the charge has been mitigated. At least that's the goal of that design. So those are the basic, I think, parameters to understand as you're starting to think through the carbon pricing design in Canada. You've got a federal system with different policies in different provinces, and the federal system only in provinces who have either willingly said, you know what, we'd rather have a federal system, or provinces who are holdouts to say, forget it, we don't want to do this, and the government's imposed it. That's the first big piece. And the second is a distinction between big industrial emitters and everybody else, small businesses, households, etc. Okay, so moving along, let's talk a little bit about how the revenue is used. I think the key here in Canada, and I know this is something that CCL supports too, is this is a revenue neutral carbon pricing regime. 90% of the funds that are collected under the fuel levy, so we're putting the industrial system aside now, but we're talking about the retail levy, and is 90% of that money goes back to Canadian households in the form of a tax credit. So every year when you file your taxes, there's a whole bunch of deductions and different allocations. And as part of that, the government will allocate you, depending on your size of household, a certain amount of money. I've actually shown, and I don't know how, hopefully it's not too small for folks on the screen, but you can see a graphic here on the right-hand side of the slide that shows what this looks like for a family of 4 in Ontario. And it starts to be real money. You can see this year, it's going to be $600 for a family of 4. That's going to rise each year, of course, as the carbon tax continues to escalate. And over the course of the next decade, we calculate that a family of 4 would receive almost $14,000 Canadian. So that's significant money, and of course something that can both offset costs and start to help people, if they're aware of it, make investments in things that were going to reduce their carbon footprint in the future. So that's been a really, really important part of the policy, and I would argue one of the reasons why carbon pricing is a popular policy in Canada for the most part. When it's polled, particularly in places like Ontario, we find that support for the policy, depending on how you question and other things, is anywhere from 50 to 65% of people who support it. Not overwhelming, but still, a majority to a decent majority. And then you have something like 25, 30% who are opposed. So it's, at worst, a 50% support, 30% opposed issue. And I think this idea of it being revenue neutral is a really critical part of that, as of course is, just growing concern about climate change. Now let's talk, so we've talked about the 90% of revenue that goes to households. the remaining 10% is split up in two different ways. So you've got 7% of the money going to small businesses, but in the form of energy efficiency grants. So you've got to apply for these grants if you want to put an installation or change out your boiler, and the federal government will provide a partial payment, 40, 50, 60%, depending on some details that probably we don't need to get into here, for that investment and upgrade in energy efficiency. So that's 7%. And then the final 3% is reserved for what we call the MUSH sector. I don't know if that's a term that you use as well, but it basically means municipalities, universities, schools, hospitals, indigenous communities. So think of this, in short form as nonprofits. And the money is also granted there for energy efficiency programs. Actually, what they do is they cycle the money every year. So one year, the money, that whole 3% goes to schools. The next year, the whole 3% goes to hospitals, just because it starts to be small dollars and it's inefficient, kind of fully spread it out every year. One of the things that we've been pushing for, and that CCL Canada has been pushing for, and we actually have managed to get mostly through now in the December announcement, because as I indicated before, there have been some recent changes, which we're going to come to in a minute. But one of the really exciting things for folks like I think on this call is that there is going to be a quarterly payment issued starting in 2022. So instead of a tax credit, which is still great, but the reality is, in our polling, we found over and over that only 1/3 of people could correctly identify that the money is going back to households right now, despite the fact that people have already been receiving this. Only 1/3 of people know about it right now, which just speaks to how challenging it is to break through to people. But you know what people do notice is checks that they get in the mail, or money that just keeps showing up in their bank account. And so we're really happy about the decision the federal government has made here to issue these quarterly payments. We think that's going to build knowledge of the rebates. And what we find, as you probably won't be surprised to learn, is that as soon as you tell people that there's a rebate, even before you've told them anything about their own specific circumstance, whether they're going to get more money back than they pay or how much they're even going to get, but as soon as you just tell them, look, all the money is going back to households and businesses, support goes up dramatically for the policy. It often goes from about 50% to 70%, 55 to 75%, because this just unlocks the concern or the reservation that some people have, even if they might want to otherwise support the policy, that, hey, this is going to cost me money. And understandably, I'm concerned about my family budget, and therefore I'm hesitant about the policy. So we think that's a big value driver. There are, I guess the last point on this slide, since we have framed this a technical briefing, I will go into a few extra technical details here, is that there are a few exemptions to this policy. It generally applies across the whole economy. It's a very broadly applied tax, the broadest one that I'm aware of in the entire world. But a couple of exemptions are, for example, there are certain fuels like diesel that is used for on-farm activities is exempt from the carbon tax. In northern communities where they don't have access to road transport, aviation is exempted in those communities because I guess for somewhat obvious reasons. And same thing goes for diesel generation in those communities where they don't actually have alternatives. But it applies with those few caveats basically to all economic activity. Okay, so moving on, I've kind of already given you the lowdown on the industrial pricing system. And so, there's a few backup details here about this. The only thing I think I didn't necessarily mention, so I'll just quickly flag it here, is that I did say that the threshold was 50,000 tons, but there is the option for smaller facilities to opt into this program all the way down to 10,000 tons. So the program is somewhat flexible. And maybe the other thing I'll mention, though I don't have it in my slides, is that we have interestingly seen a consensus now across the country on industrial pricing policies. So even though we are still in the midst of a fairly I'll call it healthy disagreement among the parties on whether to have a consumer carbon price. And it's generally the Liberal Party who's in support, as well as the Greens and the NDP. So most of the left of center parties, whereas the right of center party, our Conservative Party, is against the consumer price. That is actually not true on the industrial side. Both the federal Conservatives and a number of provincial Conservative governments who are fighting the consumer carbon tax in court have either accepted the federal government's industrial pricing system, or in most cases have adopted their own system that looks remarkably similar to the federal system. So we actually do have really an emerging consensus in our country around industrial pricing, which is real progress. And that is about a third of the emissions in Canada that are under this industrial pricing system. So we can't forget about those other 2/3. There's no question, but at least we have some cross-partisan consensus on the 1/3 and hopefully stable policy for that reason. So moving forward, let's talk a little bit about the new plan that was announced. The way this policy was put into place is it was enacted in the first term of the Trudeau government in 2018. But when the government announced the policy after negotiations with the provinces, the pricing schedule was only set to go up to $50 a ton by 2022. And that was the signature part of a broader climate policy. But even that broader climate policy only got, depending on how you make the assumptions, about 2/3 of the way to Canada's Paris target, which is clearly insufficient just on its own, but let alone trying to get to net zero by 2050, it would be nowhere near sufficient. So in December, the government came up with an enhanced climate plan that raised the ambition on a number of different fronts. But again, the centerpiece of the policy was the carbon tax. And I think much to the government's credit, they were quite brave and quite bold about the way they used carbon pricing. And they decided not only to continue to escalate the price in the midst of what we're all experiencing right now, which is the challenges around COVID, but in fact they raised the ante and they increased the price escalation, the price ramp, from what was $10 a ton to $15 a ton, as I had said earlier. And I also talked about the quarterly payments. And then another piece of it is that they increased the stringency of the industrial pricing program. So that when I talked about the 80% stringency before, they're going to continue to ratchet that up. So in other words, more of the emissions per ton of steel would actually be charged. There's a number of other elements of that plan as well. There's a variety of regulations, which we can go into a little bit in the Q&A if folks are interested, but it's things like a clean fuel standard, which mandates how much of the fuel of gasoline needs to be produced using, or actually really what it is dictating how much, how much carbon can be in each liter of fuel. There was a whole series of investments that the government pledged to make in areas that you'd likely expect, from public transit to hydrogen, to a number of other areas, building out transmission lines, things of that nature. And then, I think related to this topic around carbon pricing, the government has in the last few months signaled its intention to try to develop a border carbon adjustment policy. This has showed up in a number of government documents, a little bit out of the blue, but it's come mainly, after the election of Joe Biden in the United States. And I know from talking to folks in the government that was a major factor for them in thinking that they could move to this policy, because as much as I think folks who design policy in the federal government around climate recognize the value of a border carbon adjustment, the reality is for a country like ours that's so dependent on the trade relationship with the United States, where we are really frankly, the small partner in that relationship, it's just not very practical for us to develop unilaterally a border carbon adjustment, or at least that's been the thinking up to now. But given that there seems to be a new posture in terms of climate ambition in the United States, I think there's a number of areas in which Canada is looking at how our country can develop a strategic alliance on climate action with your country, with the United States. And there's a number of areas, from fuel economy standards to methane regulations, that are part of that. But one piece of that is a border carbon adjustment, and the idea, could we create some sort of common policy? And of course, critically for Canada, I think, would be to try to get some reciprocity in the cross-border relationship between our two countries, so we don't see any border carbon fees applied to Canadian goods from the US or vice versa. Just moving along, and I see we're at about 8:30, so I'm going to try to, I'll probably try to wrap up in the next couple of minutes and take questions. This is a pretty dense slide, so I wouldn't worry too much about the numbers, but really this is just saying, we've run some modeling to try to understand what are the impacts of Canada's carbon pricing system as it relates to trying to get both to our 2030 climate target and to the net zero emissions goal. We actually did this prior to the government making their announcement, which is why we see a bunch of scenarios. There's 3 rows with 3 different scenarios here, but let me focus on the last row at the bottom, which most closely mirrors what the government has announced. And basically the punchline of this is that what we find is that this pricing policy could generate about it's going to take us well beyond our Paris target. So it's going to generate an additional 159 megatons of reductions by 2030. To put that in context, we have about 700 megatons of emissions in the whole country right now, and it will get us well past our 2030 target. And then as it pertains to net zero, we find that this policy could get us about 60% of the way to net zero emissions. So that's really, really big, of course. Like, that's an incredibly important start. It's clearly not the whole way. So the point is that I think part of what we were doing in this report was to try to get beyond what we find is a bit of a tired debate that we're having in Canada, and perhaps it's happening in the US too, around should we have a carbon tax? Some people saying, look, carbon tax is the only policy and is the answer to everything, and others saying, no, we shouldn't have a carbon tax. From our view, we believe a carbon tax should be the centerpiece of a climate plan. It's going to be an incredibly powerful part of it, a critical part of it, probably the biggest, almost for sure the most important part of it. But there are still a lot of other investments that are going to need to be made to complement that policy. And we started in this report, and we can talk about this more in the discussion if people want, to say, where does pricing work really well? What are the areas where we need to put in place other kinds of investments or regulations to complement it? I think I'll skip past this because it's fairly technical. We can go over it if anyone actually wants. And then I'll just conclude with this slide and just talk a little bit more about border carbon adjustments. I mean, I guess I did kind of already give you a lot of the punchlines here, but just scanning the slide, I just want to see if I missed anything. And I think maybe the only other thing I'll mention here is that I think this is going to take some time. The federal government is interested in this, but I think most folks are thinking this is 2 to 3 years away at best. That would be probably the fastest. This may be something that takes 4, 5, 6 years to fully develop. It's still unclear what shape that will take. And of course, other countries like the EU, as you'll likely know, are trying to grapple with that as well. What they want to apply a border carbon tax, but is it going to apply to all goods? Is it going to only be a select set of goods at the beginning? The steels and cements and things of that nature at first. It's still too early to say in Canada. In fact, there's been fairly minimal thinking yet about this. I think this is more something that the government knows they need to sort out. And I think they're eager to start to do that in partnership with their US counterparts. And And so I expect that there will be some discussions between the countries in the coming months to try to map that out. We at Clean Prosperity are doing our own research on this in partnership with another group in Canada to try to lay out some of the different design options. But I don't think this is something that's going to happen right away. And of course, in Canadian climate policy, one of the factors that's always on the minds of folks is the oil and gas industry here, right? We have a big oil and gas industry. We are a resource-intensive economy, and so politicians are constantly thinking about that. What are going to be the impacts on that sector, and the understandable concerns about workers in that sector in particular. So. I think that's where I'll probably stop here. The report itself, which I know was linked earlier, does talk a lot about, which I haven't talked about here, but does talk a lot about some of the technology that we think can be enabled through this increased carbon price. We think at the trajectory that the government is committed to, all carbon capture and storage technology essentially becomes profitable. We also think that the price will enable investments in the carbon removal and carbon management sector, things like direct air capture, carbon utilization products, and clean tech more broadly. So we could talk a little bit about that in discussion too if folks are interested, but let me stop there and just see what questions and comments you have.
Bravo. Thank you so much, Michael. I'm going to let Cathy handle the Q&A, but I did just want to underscore again how much we here on the state side of things resonated with your framing, with your core premise of the fee and dividend being the backbone policy by which other necessary policies are also going to be implemented. And I know that also we had some pre-submitted questions. I think we actually got to all of those, except for one about public opinion through your presentation. So Cathy, I'll let you take these in the order by which we're seeing them here in the chat. But again, a reminder for all those that are joining us on YouTube or here on Zoom, we're not going to go to the phones until we get through all of the chat questions. So feel free to put yours in the queue if you want to make sure yours is considered.
Yes, wonderful presentation. Thank you, Michael. There are questions in the chat, and the first one is, how has public opinion on the policy changed since implementation? You touched it a bit, but you... Yeah.
It's a great question. It has, so we saw an increase in support for the policy right when the policy was announced. So there's a lot of different polls done on this, but just to give you a rough sense of things, it went from kind of 40-45% support to 50-55% support. So it bumped up 5 to 10 points depending on the poll. When the government first rolled out the policy, they got a bit of a bounce from it. Since then, it's actually stayed fairly flat and fairly stable. And so it's kind of been about that 50-55 support. It depends on the poll, depends how you ask the question. We have found, though, in the last few, interestingly, that during COVID, there has actually been a little bit of an increase in support for the policy, maybe counterintuitively. It wasn't, frankly, what I was expecting. But I think folks in Canada, best as I can tell, because you always have to sort of interpret things a little bit, but it seems that folks are connecting the health crisis that we face right now with the potential future crises, and frankly, some present ones too, that we will face from climate change, and that people's commitment to the policy has grown a little bit. So I'm talking, another 4 or 5%, nothing super dramatic. So yeah, the polls now are probably typically around a 55 support, 30% oppose, and 15% will say, I don't know.
Okay, great. I think you've mostly touched on that second question on border carbon adjustments, so I will skip over that, but that was a great question, whoever put it there. What impact, if any, have been documented and attributed to this policy?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So because it's early on, we don't have any estimates yet of the impact on the federally. We have projections and we have models that have looked at this. So the price, the original pricing system that went to $50 a ton was estimated to get between $50 and $60 megatons of reductions. And just as a reminder, we emit about 730 megatons as a country in Canada. So we're talking just under 10% of emissions would be reduced from that first $50 a ton price. And by rough math, by the way, I think it's $50 Canadian is probably about $35 US. I'm kind of ballparking that, but it's probably something around there. And then the fuller price, the 170, our estimate is that we're going to get closer to 200 megatons of reductions from there. So we're going to get a very significant reduction. But in terms of what has happened in the first 2 years, we don't, to my knowledge, have estimates yet of that. The best we do have is from British Columbia, which has had this kind of a policy for longer. And we have seen there that it's reduced emissions, depending on the study, between 5 and 15%. So I have to kind of average those out and say about 10% has been the emissions impact from the British Columbia tax, which is currently like the federal one at $30. Actually, I believe the BC one is at 35 a ton right now.
I pretty much answer the same way too when I get that question. So it's nice to know that we don't have any real world evidence yet.
Yeah.
Still looking at the models.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. Okay. Does this policy have support from all or most political parties in Canada? And maybe just add a little bit about election 2019 to contextualize it a bit for the audience, please.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, no, it's quite interesting. So, in Canada we have multiple parties, more than two parties. Although we have really two that are kind of the bigger parties that have the most likely chance of forming government. But on the left, you have three parties that have a national presence and a fourth party that has a regional presence in Quebec. All four of those parties were in 2019 and still are in favor of the carbon tax. They each had a little bit of nuance around their sort of ways they wanted to design it or use the revenue, but they were all in favor of it. The Conservative Party, which is right of center, has been opposed to it. And in fact, not only were they opposed to it, but in the 2019 election, they actually used that as one of their top election issues. If you looked at the ads they ran or the things that the leader spoke about in his speech. And in fact, I believe his pledge was that the first thing he would do when he formed government was going to be to repeal the carbon tax. And he spent a lot of time and money attacking it and talking about how unaffordable it was. Of course, he didn't mention ever the rebate that was coming. He would only talk about the increase in costs. And Canadians, the election, of course, was decided on a number of issues. But our evidence, we did some extensive polling in Ontario, where the bulk of the province that has the most seats and often for a variety of reasons helps determine the outcome of elections. And we found that the opposition to the carbon tax was actually a net detriment, a net anchor holding the Conservatives back in the province. When we do our polling, we find that swing voters, 2/3 of those swing voters, the kinds of voters that the Conservatives would need to win over in order to form government, say both that they can't vote for a party that doesn't have a credible climate plan. And that same 2/3 also says that a carbon tax is part of a credible climate plan. So we're in a situation here in Canada where the carbon tax has actually become a kind of a litmus test for whether you have a credible climate plan. Not because the average voter understands the policy necessarily, or certainly all the details, but they see that as it's become a kind of a signal. And so that's been a really encouraging development. And so the Conservative Party now, who have a new leader since that last election, are in the process of developing their climate policy. And it is an open question as to what they're going to do on the carbon tax. They probably, given what's been said publicly it does appear more likely than not that the party is going to continue to oppose the policy. But we are, at Clean Prosperity, have been working very closely, or as closely anyway as we can, with the Conservatives and talking to as many elected representatives as we can about the idea that, what would a conservative version of this policy look like? If you don't want to just adopt the policy of your political opponents, that's in some ways understandable, putting the merits of the policy aside, just understanding this is how politics works. But if we take that as a given, how can they design a policy that works for them and that they could argue is even better than the Liberal policy? Let's look at improving this policy. Let's not look at just dismissing it because your political opponents have offered it. And so I won't get into the details of what that could look like right now for sake of time, but that's how we're handling that.
Wonderful. Okay, so this is about the dividend and the current system right now that we have with regards to it still being shifted within our taxes. Does the dividend through the tax credit system reach all low income, or are there gaps?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the one gap, so the credit, there's two parts to this answer. The credit does go to folks even if they owe no income taxes. You will still get your rebate. The chart that I had showed, for example, if you're a family of 4, and even if you're showing 0 income, you do get that money. The caveat, though, is that you need to submit a tax filing. And unfortunately, there are people in Canada, I'm sure this is true in the United States too, who, despite the fact that it is required, do not file taxes. And because of that, there are, I think the numbers I saw is something like 10% of the population, which actually was surprising to me that it's so high. But those folks would not be eligible for this tax credit. And that will be true, by the way, even under the quarterly payment, because the way that the government will know to issue you the payment and calculate what you should be receiving is based on your tax filing. I think it's, to my knowledge, the only way they could come up with that information, because what you're entitled to depends on the size of your household. And I guess one thing I didn't say earlier is there also is an extra top up for rural residents. If you live in a non-urban area, you get 10% more than urban residents do. We actually believe that should be even higher. That should be about 20% based on the analysis we've done. But anyway, that's how it works. And that's the answer to that. So you should get it, but there are people who aren't getting it today.
Okay, great. This is from a YouTube viewer, and it's with regards to the MUSH stakeholders. And for those who missed that, that is municipalities, universities, and basically our non-for-profit sector, if you want to look at it that way, schools and hospitals. What was the main motivator for the 10% given to the MUSH stakeholders? The fee impacting their bottom line without getting the dividend, question mark?
Yeah, that's essentially it, right? So if you're a hospital, you have carbon taxes that you have to pay for your heating costs and for your electricity and other things. And so, the thought was that those institutions should receive some benefit from it, especially if that money can be used to make those facilities more energy efficient and thus have lower carbon costs in the future. I think that was really the motivation for that, as far as I know.
Okay, I skipped a couple because time is of the essence, and this is an interesting one. Are the provinces running their own carbon pricing programs, doing rebates or dividends too? If not, is there pressure on them from their residents to switch to the federal system that can benefit them? Yeah,
that's a great question. So it really is a mix of policies. You do have, I'm just thinking through the different provinces. There are some examples of provinces with their own systems who are issuing rebates, but most of them are not. You have BC, for example, that has income tax cuts with some rebates to low-income households. You have Quebec that has a cap and trade system where no revenue is returned to citizens. Instead, that money is used to invest in green infrastructure. And then you have a range, you kind of have a mix of some other policies. So it is happening in some cases, but in others it's not. And interestingly, you know, in New Brunswick, just as an example, where a conservative premier just recently decided to participate, or to, I guess, adopt his own version of carbon pricing, he actually chose not to make it revenue neutral, which I was fairly surprised about. So it really is quite a mix. But I guess to the second part of your question, I don't believe yet, I have not heard much about pressure being exerted by provincial residents to adopt the federal system. I think, interestingly, folks in Canada, for the most part, actually tend to prefer having a provincial system, just all else equal. They tend to think provincial, I don't know, maybe it's closer to home, and there's been a history of provinces being in charge of environmental policy. So generally, when you ask the question, who do you think should be in charge of administering the carbon tax, people tend to choose their province. I think that might change in the future as the rebates go up, as the payments become more visible. I think you could see some pressure there, but it hasn't occurred yet.
So many questions. This is a straightforward one, and I think it's a good one to highlight. Why different rebates for different provinces? So why does Saskatchewan and Alberta get way more than
That's a great question. Yeah, so the revenue that's collected in a province stays in that province. That was part of the agreement that was made by the provinces. So if you are in a province that has higher emissions because of the nature of your economy, you're going to see higher rebates, and it is quite significant. So in Ontario, I think the highest rebate in 2030 is something like $2,000. In Saskatchewan and Alberta, if memory serves me, it's over $10,000. So it's a real, it's many multiples. And Saskatchewan and Alberta have the highest rebates. Now, somewhat ironically, I guess their premiers are ones who are fighting this policy harder than maybe almost anyone else. But that's going to be a powerful draw for people once the rebates get up to those levels.
Excellent. Okay, this one's about the Supreme Court. Has the Canadian Supreme Court ruled to affirm the legal status?
Right.
Do you call it constitutionality of the carbon pricing policy? And yes, we call it the constitutionality.
Yeah, that's right. Great question. No, it has not yet ruled. We're expecting that ruling could be any day, likely in the next couple of months. The hearing was in September. It typically takes something like 4 to 6 months to render a decision. So that would be January to March, which we're right in the heart of now. Most legal scholars expect that the federal government will win that case. But yes, there is a challenge about whether the government has the right to impose this fee on the provinces.
I like this one because I think it'll help prepare USA members for not all states agreeing with carbon pricing once a federal price comes in, and just dealing with it all. Ontario. If voters in Ontario are mostly pro-carbon tax on the federal level, then why is their premier against it? And he's relatively popular. So it's weird. Okay, go for it, Michael.
It's a great question. I mean, I think the short answer is there's other issues that were motivating voters that weren't the carbon tax. We were at a period of time in Ontario where the Liberal government had been in power for a long time, much more than 10 years. And over time, governments get stale, make mistakes, etc. And it was kind of just time. And although the carbon, and then the other piece of it was that the Liberal government that was in power, the provincial Liberal government, had a cap and trade system that was more opaque than the current design of the federal carbon tax. People were not getting rebates, and the way the system worked was not clear to people. And so it made it much easier for the now premier to attack Doug Ford to attack that policy and try to gain some political traction over what was already some discontent with the then administration.
Okay, this is a good question. Is it, you won't see it because it's a direct message to me, but is it difficult for businesses to have different climate policies in different provinces?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And yes, it absolutely is. And, interestingly, the business community in Canada has been some of the most vocal supporters of carbon pricing, including the oil and gas sector, by the way. They see, and actually, if I'm not mistaken, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce just came out and supported carbon pricing as well. And I think the motivations are similar, is that, the writing is on the wall. There is going to be climate action and climate policy. And so businesses prefer carbon pricing, and they prefer a more coordinated system than a less coordinated one. So yes, they are clamoring for a more harmonized system, but our Constitution is what it is, and I think unfortunately this is a cost there for the foreseeable future going to have to bear.
Okay, this is a technical question. What will Canada do about emissions of CO2 and methane in refining in oil, gas, and coal production? Because that gets a little complex in Canada, I believe, but thank you, Michael.
Yeah, what will they do about it? So in other words, how will we address those emissions? So there's a mix of policies. I mean, carbon taxes themselves are intended to level the playing field for renewable energy and make it, of course, as you would know, more expensive to burn fossil fuels. And as a result of that, we're seeing coal plants shut down even faster than was predicted. And Canada actually had a regulation to phase out all coal plants by 2030. But in fact, in Alberta, the expectation now is that coal plants will be phased out in the next couple of years, and already are being phased out quite quickly because of the carbon tax. But I think as it pertains to, say, methane emissions, that's a broader problem that carbon taxes help with in terms of making alternatives to natural gas, whether that be for electricity or heating, more attractive. But you're going to have complementary policies that are needed, especially when you're talking about things like fugitive emissions that need to be monitored before they could even be priced. And so the government is putting in place some regulations around methane as well, and taking a bit of using multiple policies to try to address this. So that's my short answer on that one. It's a pretty long topic.
No, that's great. Okay, so I think we've got most of the questions, other than somebody's wanting the data that shows how opinion changes when people know they get the rebate. I don't know if you have that quickly on hand.
I don't have it on probably something that I could pull up right this second, but I will say that if they did want to go to our website, which is cleanprosperity.ca, they could probably find that information. It's definitely on there. It's just a question of whether our site has been made easily navigatable, and I think it has been. To see that, you'll see a series of polling results we've done over the last year plus that show consistently that bump as soon as people learn about the rebate.
This was awesome. Okay, one last one about messaging. So the PM has done a great job on messaging, the way he's presented it. Maybe would you like to speak to that?
Sure.
Is he talking more about the dividend, or just the way he's saying it?
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
Sure. Yeah, I think there's been definitely some bright spots there, and I think there have been a few challenges. I'll try to briefly mention both, because I know we've only got about a minute or so left. I think that they definitely have focused a lot on the affordability of the policy, and the fact that 8 out of 10 people get more money back than they pay. The government has been very diligent about calling this a price on pollution and really framing this as pollution, something that's going to harm you and something that we can't allow to be free, because when it's free, people are going to produce more of it. So I think they've kept it fairly simple in that regard. I think that's been probably helpful. The place where I think they've fallen down a little bit is in communicating the rebates. The government decided to call the rebates a climate action incentive payment, which is just a mouthful and something nobody understands. You know, as a result of that, you know, you can even see all the media calls it a rebate, but people call it climate action incentive. And so the language being consistent and simple is really key here. I haven't seen the government really, you know, really repeat that message about the rebates. And as a result, not enough people know about it. And I'll just conclude by saying, you know, just to illustrate how critical simple messaging is and how choices of language really matter. You know, we interestingly did a question in one of our polls that said, is a carbon price and a carbon tax, or rather I said, is the federal carbon tax and the federal carbon price the same thing or different things? Just see what people would say. And it was basically like random chance. It was like people, 50% said same, 50% said different. Like people just weren't aware. So using simple, consistent language, I think really important. I think the federal government has a bit of improvement they can make on that front.
Michael, we are so grateful for your time. We realize that you are already at 9 o'clock where you're at, so we will sign off here. But if anyone has ongoing questions, I will put in the chat where you can find the link for our training for anyone that didn't make it live. We get over 90% of our views actually on the backswing for people that didn't make it on the on-demand side. So those are in the chat. We are so grateful for your time. I'm going to allow everyone else to unmute to shower you with the gratitude that you deserve.
Well, we appreciate it.
Available.
Oh, thank you. Thanks very much. It was great to be here, and great questions. Really pleasure to be with all of you, and thanks for all your work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Great.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you.
Yeah, appreciate it. Thank you all.
Well, stay safe up there and have a wonderful rest of your night. Keep up the
Thank
great
you.
work.
Yeah,
Michael.
all
You're
of you
an
too.
Inspiration for all of us.
Thank you. I really appreciate that.
Oh, Michael, thank you so much.
Thanks, Cathy. Always great to talk to you.
We'll be talking soon.